Hello, I'm Chris Hartwell, and welcome to The Heartbeat, the place where I talk about just a few of the things that make this little guy tick. Today, I'm going to be talking about episode 3 of season 2 of AMC's Better Call Saul. Join me, won't you? And we're back. I apologize for my absence last week on episode 2, but I sort of had something else to attend to, so not a problem though. We are now back and jumping straight on into it, which is actually exactly what Jimmy McGill did at the top of this episode, really taking another significant step towards Saul Goodman by quite literally dressing a specific way to attract a certain kind of client. And seeing that, as well as his wholehearted willingness to bribe this bus driver, really does have me convinced that the primary difference between the Jimmy McGill of this season and the Jimmy McGill of last season is here we now have a man who's really stopped trying to break good. He's getting more and more calloused and just unaffected by the light. Even looking at his response from last week to Kim's chastisement over fabricating evidence, he actually never admitted that what he did was wrong, but simply promised that he would keep such things hidden from her the next time. That doesn't occasionally mean he's not trying to do the right thing. He's just stopped doing it, at least for a while now, for the right reasons. And speaking of one of those not-so-right reasons, though lightly played the last couple episodes, one of the highlights for me this season has been the ever-evolving relationship between Jimmy and Chuck. Their interactions have just so perfectly captured what a pair of feuding siblings look like, and the places that rivalry can push them. And indeed, Chuck is pushing Jimmy places, because when it comes down to it, who James McGill really is at his core is a performer. He's a showman, and what every circus ringmaster needs is an audience. And Chuck has once again in episode 3 become that motivating audience for him. And though he's no longer the cheerleading squad that Jimmy believed he was back in season 1, he at least can make his brother bear shameful witness of his success. And because Chuck knows of his brother's slip-in tendencies, the success of pulling the wool over his eyes will be made all the sweeter. And that's not the only relationship that has been used to great effect this season, especially in the last 2 episodes. Kim was to Jimmy as season 1 Chuck was to his brother, or Marco was to Cicero Jimmy. And though spiting his brother has granted Jimmy some form of satisfaction, we still do see a man who longs for that positive reinforcement, that positive cheering audience, so to speak, in moments like the one where he tries to play footsies with Kim under the table. Unfortunately, in both episode 2 and now again in episode 3, we see the writers more and more having that positive audience recoil. Like when Kim shuts Jimmy down for fabricating the cobbler squatting evidence. And then having the upstanding audience feel strange and removed. Like the beautifully awkward scene between Jimmy and the guitar-playing Cliff Main in his weirdly decorated office. And then having the negative audience feel suffocating. Like Chuck returning to HHM. And I point all this out because to best track Jimmy's evolution, we really need to identify those who matter to him most. And in season 1, that was Chuck, who Jimmy thought he could nurse back to health if he stayed on the straight and narrow. And in season 2, it's primarily Kim, who's really put her neck on the line for Jimmy and will suffer the consequences if he strays from that path. Which are just great stakes, and I love the moment where Kim implores Jimmy, "We both know you can do this job. You just have to do it right." And there's just that tragic glimmer in Jimmy's eyes where he realizes he could, but he just doesn't really want to anymore. And something else I really appreciated about this episode were just the returning characters, like the 2 punk film students or Mrs. Strauss, because what their return and my further enjoyment of their personalities told me was, this show is creating characters that I'm excited to see time and again versus just waiting around and biding my time for the cameos from Jesse Pinkman or Walter White. And then again, this is a prequel series, and there will ultimately have to be some sort of building up to a time and a place that we know. But that doesn't mean that we can't enjoy the ride prior to that point and get surprised by a few twists and turns along the way. So, for example, I have really loved the handling of Mike Ehrmantraut's storyline, and especially in this episode, because ultimately, yes, we do know that he will end up working for the drug lord, Gus Fring. But we don't actually need to know that fate in order to believe and enjoy his current struggle of trying to make ends meet for his widowed daughter-in-law, Stacy. And in the same way, I really enjoyed the usage of Jimmy's TV commercial in this episode, because it introduced us to one of these staples of Saul Goodman from Breaking Bad, but did so in a way that was more about impacting this story versus just winking at the audience. So in contrast, Hank McCoy asking young Charles Xavier in X-Men First Class if he would be up for shaving his head. Oh yes, yes. Very good. Very clever. Well done. Well done. Well done. Speaking of Mike and Jimmy, though, in this episode, one of the things that I really did appreciate is just the writer's continued juxtaposing of those two characters, because in this situation, both men are really desperately trying to convince those closest to them of something, but again, both men are unable to do so in just the sort of straightforward, honest way. Though with Mike, especially, it's not from a lack of trying. I mean, the man, after being given the cold shoulder by Stacy, guards her house all night and then heads straight to his day job and still has the kindness and grace not to make her feel dumb for imagining gunshots. And that's something these screenwriters have done exceptionally well from Breaking Bad until now, just making their main characters squirm and writhe and claw for the easy way out, but never giving it to them. And what's truly phenomenal is, as I'm forced to watch these characters choose between rolling over and dying or biting back, and just that painful ascent downwards, I still can't tear my eyes away. And indeed, what Jimmy and Mike both realize is they will have to descend further to get what they want. One for the love of his family, and the other for the spite of his family. Or as the veterinarian puts it, you want next level pay? You're gonna have to do next level work. I also wanted to point out how fitting I thought it was that Jimmy and Kim were watching the film Ice Station Zebra, which is set during the Cold War and is about a US submarine attempting to recover pictures from a Russian spy satellite, because this show is absolutely in the midst of a Cold War right now, with Chuck on one side and Jimmy on the other. And this is a Cold War. No shots have been fired yet, but there is such a distrust between both men, and they're looking for any reason they can to heat things up. And also reminiscent of Ice Station Zebra, where a Russian spy has infiltrated that US sub, is just how Chuck has pushed his way back into HHM to bear witness, i.e. sabotage Jimmy and this once safe place. And continuing to look at the films that were referenced in this episode, I thought the nods to Sunset Boulevard were also very fitting. Because yes, it was very humorous to have Mrs. Strauss quote one of the film's most famous lines, but it was also interesting to compare the desperate and unsuccessful screenwriter Joe Gillis to our hero James McGill, as both men attempt to manipulate the elderly in their quest for success. Though if you've seen Sunset Boulevard, you know things don't end so well for Mr. Gillis, so I am curious how much, if any, of that trajectory the writers on Better Call Saul have attempted to imitate, which does kind of lead me to one of my minor quibbles for this episode, that just being the ease with which Jimmy is able to hoodwink the elderly. I mean, does no one on that bus question why a lawyer would just be waiting alongside the road? I'm also just a little bit concerned about where Jimmy's cliffhanger will end up next week. I just don't want a very quick, oh, it's all right, or the executives watch the TV commercial and say, this is brilliant, all is forgiven, Jimmy. That would just, for me anyways, really cheapen the oh no moment that we were left with this week. I am curious in a positive way to see where Mike's storyline is going and who exactly Nacho wants him to take care of. Part of me isn't quite yet ready for Gus Fring. Well, at the same time, if he were to show up, I'm sure I would be jumping up and down for joy, because I have so dearly missed that man. Yes, all of his face. If you guys have enjoyed this at all, even just the smallest amount, I'm sure you would enjoy some much more brilliant, articulately stated thoughts on the Better Talk Saul podcast. I'll leave the link below where to check that out. Dylan has some great stuff going on over there, and I'm sure you would all enjoy that. I personally, though, would still love to know what you guys thought of the episode, so please comment below. Let me know. Did you love it? Did you hate it? What worked for you? What didn't? Comment below. Let me know. Also, please do subscribe. I'm going to continue to review films and television on this channel, and I would love for you all to stay up to date on all of those things. But for now, I'm Chris Hartwell. This is The Heartbeat. Thank you for joining me.